Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. I'm Amy Johnson Crow, and this week we are going to tackle the topic of the 5 things you need to do before you cross the pond with your ancestors. Now, here is where it often starts. We are researching our ancestors, and perhaps we have maybe a general idea of where one of our family lines might be from. So we start to do a little bit of research and we go into the census. And all of a sudden, we actually see it in writing that our ancestor was from Poland, or they were from Austria, or they were from Ireland. And it seems to suddenly confirm that family story or that inkling that we have. And it's a very natural response once we see a record like this that we want to go immediately to that other country. All of a sudden, we're ready to go start researching in Poland, or we want to start researching in Ireland. It's just natural. It's a natural response. But if we do that, if we all of a sudden go from one census record and all of a sudden try to start researching in a completely different country, we're going to be setting ourselves up for failure because we just don't have enough information. Because how can you correctly identify the right John Kelly in Ireland, or the right David Davies in Wales, or the right Joseph Mueller in Germany? You really need to have more than just a name before you can do successful research in another country. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. How can we take our research from that one census record and get it to the place where we can actually move our research into another country and make sure that we have the right person? Well, to do that, we really need to have more than just a person's name and what country they came from. We need to have something more specific, ideally a town or a county that they came from. Ireland is a big country. We need to know where in Ireland. Germany is the same way. Poland is the same way. It's not just enough to say, well, my ancestor came from Ireland, so now I'm ready to do Irish research. No, you really need something more specific. And you need other ways of identifying that ancestor besides just their name. And what I mean by that is, how else can you describe this person? What religion did they follow? What occupation did they have? And can you identify points on their timeline? When they were born, when they married, when did they immigrate to the United States? So all of those different points that you can put on a person's timeline could really help you when you're trying to move your research back into another country. And this last point is absolutely key. Who else are they associated with? Can we identify siblings and other family members? What about the neighbors that they are living nearby? Because as we will see in a little bit, that could play into not only who they immigrated with, but could they actually be distantly related? So we need to have these other people in mind as well. So it's not just enough to have a person's name and a country. How else can we describe them? Whether it's by a more specific origin, other ways of identifying the person, and who else are they associated with? Okay, so I promised you 5 things to do before you cross the pond. Number 1, look at home. So often we don't think about the records that we might actually have in our own house or our parents' house or our grandparents' house. And what I mean by this are things like family Bibles, letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings. All of these items could give us those clues that I talked about just a moment ago. More specific origins, religion, occupation, siblings, and other people that they're associated with. So all of these home sources could be very, very good for giving us clues that we need to gather before we cross the pond. So number one, look at home. Step number two, find that person in all of the censuses that you should find them in the United States. Because in various censuses, it's possible to pull out clues that deal with their migration and their naturalization status. And it's also a great way to find those neighbors. And what do we know about neighbors? They might be related. So looking at that census and seeing who's living on either side of them, several houses, who else is living on the same street, who else is living on that same block, and do we find them living near these same people across multiple censuses? As an example, looking at clues about immigration and naturalization, just as an example, this is the 1920 U.S. Census. And there's a section on the 1920 census right here in the middle. Now, we tend to stay over here on the left where we're looking at the person's name and how they're all related to the head of the household. But there's this wonderful section here that talks about citizenship. And I'll blow it up so that it's a little bit easier to read. But it asks questions like the year the person immigrated to the United States. And it also asks about their naturalization status, whether they were an alien, in other words, the citizenship process had not yet started, or they were naturalized. And if they were naturalized, they were supposed to record what year that happened. Now, we don't see it on this example, but another choice that the census taker had when recording naturalization information in the 1920 census was to also record PA, meaning that first papers had been filed, but the naturalization process had not yet been completed. So, what clues can we pull out from the census? And this type of information is going to vary from census year to census year. So you do want to take a look at all of those censuses to pull out all of that information that you can. Again, this is an example from 1920. You're not going to see this exactly in this format in every U.S. Census. So again, make sure that you're finding that person in every U.S. Census in which they should appear. Step number 3, find records related to their death. And this might sound a little strange, but there is so much information that tends to be recorded when a person dies. And so records that we want to look for include things like death records, but I don't mean just the death record that's at the courthouse or at the health department. I mean not only those civil death records, but also any church death records that might exist. Take a look at burial and cemetery records, obituaries, and also tombstones. Now, before I go any further talking about death records, there is one very important thing to keep in mind whenever you're working with death records, and that is the information about a person's birth. And that's really what we're looking for here in these death records. We're really trying to find information about the person's birth. That information is really dependent upon how informed the person was who was giving the information. So if John Kelly dies and his wife is giving the information about his birth, does she really know about it? What about if John Kelly dies and his grandson is the informant on that death record? How well does he know his grandfather? Does he really know exactly where Grandpa was born? So that is something to keep in mind. It's a little caveat to bear in mind whenever you're working with death records. But let's take an example. Let's take a look at some of these examples and see what type of information we can pull out from these different records related to a person's death. Now, again, when we think about death records, we tend to think immediately about sort of the modern death certificate, which is kept by civil authorities, whether it is a health department, a Bureau of Vital Statistics. This modern death certificate has so much information, and one of the things that it almost always asks is the birthplace. And in this particular instance, it's telling us that Michael Kelly not only was born in Ireland, but he was born in County Waterford, Ireland. So, we don't have it down to a specific town in this instance, but we do have at least a county. We've taken the entirety of Ireland, and now we have something a little narrower to look at. We can now maybe start focusing on the Kellys in County Waterford. But don't overlook any death records that might have been created by the church. Here's an example from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America records, and these ELCA records are available exclusively on archives.com. So looking at this death record for Ferdinand Bayer, and this is from a church in Iowa, but it's reporting in this ELCA death record that he was, and has the abbreviation for geboren, which is German for born. So we're seeing in this death record that he was born in Neudeck, Rosenberg, West Preußen, Germany. So something very, very specific out of this particular church death record. So if you can find what church they were affiliated with, and look to see if you can find any church death records. Sometimes they can be very, very detailed. Obituaries. Always, always, always look for obituaries for your ancestors. Here's an example of an obituary from the San Francisco Call newspaper from March of 1907, and it reports that Dennis Haley, who died March the 2nd, was a native of Tuam, County Galway, Ireland. So now, not only do we know that he's from Ireland, we know he's from County Galway, and we actually now have him into a specific town. So great, great information here from this particular obituary. Tombstones. I've often joked that I don't think I've ever been to a cemetery that I didn't like. And this particular tombstone is from a Catholic cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. And you might notice immediately that this tombstone is written in Italian, even though the tombstone is in central Ohio. So as we're looking at this tombstone and we are translating it, one thing I want to point out is at the very bottom of the tombstone, where it says Nata in, and I am going to butcher this horribly, my Italian is awful, Giulianova, which actually is a town on the eastern coast of Italy. So we have an idea now exactly where this person was born. So great information there on the tombstone. Again, always keeping in mind that whenever we're working with a death record, how accurate was the knowledge of the person who gave this information to the stone carver. So it's a really great clue that we need to follow up on. Step number 4, before we cross the pond looking for our ancestors, learn their church affiliations. Religion has been so important in the lives of so many of our ancestors, and it's a great way that we can identify our ancestors is by what church they were affiliated with. And one thing to keep in mind is that People generally didn't change their religion dramatically. Yeah, they might change from one denomination to another, but typically not radically. So, for example, if the ancestor that you're researching here in the United States is Jewish, they're probably not Catholic back in Germany. So, you just don't see radical changes in their religious affiliations. It's more common to see it's more common to see changes, say, within Protestant denominations, but even then it tends to be not very radical. You tend to not see somebody go from Southern Baptist to Lutheran. You tend to see when there is a shift in Protestant denominations, it's usually between denominations that are a little more closely aligned theologically. So if you're seeing something, you're trying to match up people with the same name and trying to figure out if it's the same person, try to take a look at their church and see if that's a way that you can better identify them. And step number 5, research those siblings and those neighbors. Because did these people migrate together? Researching these siblings and the neighbors could give you clues for your ancestor. And why is that? Well, it all deals with migration patterns. People typically did not migrate all by themselves. What we see typically are two types of migrations. A chain migration, which is also sometimes referred to as serial migration, where one group moves to a new place. Say a group moves from a town in Germany and they end up settling in Fairfield County, Ohio. Well, that group gets well established in Fairfield County. They're buying land and they're being very successful, being very prosperous, and they encourage others back in their little town in Germany to come over and join them. So you see this chain migration, it happens over a period of time, but it's people from one location over a period of time moving to this new location. And we also see push and pull factors. What factors are pushing out large numbers of people? It could be changes in the economy, or or war, or religious persecution. But it's something that affects not just one family, but something that's affecting a large number of people. And something else to keep in mind when we're talking about migration patterns is that immigrants didn't pick a new home at random. Yeah, we've seen the stories, in the movies, and it's, kind of romantic, especially when we think about people moving out to the American West. That let's take a map and we'll take a pin and we'll just, wherever we stick this pin, that's where we're going to move. Well, it makes for a great movie, but that's really not how it happened. People tended to settle with similar people. As I talked about a moment ago with chain migration, you have people who went ahead, say from a specific town in Germany, and they moved to Fairfield County, Ohio, and they're writing back to their relatives and their friends back in Germany. Well, hey, when they decide to move, they already know that Fairfield County, Ohio is a great place to settle. And they already have friends and family already living there. So that's where they're going to move into. That's the area where they're going to migrate to. So we see people who tend to settle with people who were originally from their hometown. Maybe they were members of the same church, but it's very unusual to see a person or see a family move to a town where they have absolutely no ties. So taking a look at those neighbors, taking a look at the siblings and researching them, can we find their origins? Because if we can find their origins, we might be able to find our ancestors' origins because they all came over from the same place. So essentially, what to do before you cross the pond, it can be summed up in this. Learn everything you can about them in the United States first. Don't just find them in one census and then, boom, start to try to do research in another country. No, take the time to really research them here in the United States. Find their death records, find their associates. Look at home to see what records you already have here. Do that run of the census. Learn about that person, because the more you can discover about that person and their life in the United States, the more clues you will have when you start to do research in another country. And the more clues you have, the more success you will have in your research. All right, next week on the archives.com live stream, we are going to take a look at an average family, putting your ancestors in context. And that will be next Wednesday, the 4th of September, at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, stay connected with archives.com, whether it is on our blog, whether it's liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter, or seeing our archived live streams that are available on our YouTube channel. And I would like to point out, if you are interested in learning even more about finding your ancestors' origins, I encourage you to go over to our YouTube channel and look for the video, Where in the World? Finding Your Ancestors' Origins. And there are some other examples in there of ways that you can get more specific, try to find more specific places of your ancestors' origins. So again, that video is called Where in the World? Finding Your Ancestors' Origins. So, as I said, next week we'll be talking about putting your ancestors in context at the same time next Wednesday, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. And until then, I'm Amy Johnson Crow, wishing you happy researching.